Chapter 7. The Act of Creation. The offense of Scripture is felt with especial intensity in our time with reference to the doctrine of creation. Academic respectability could no doubt be gained, and the tension with modern scientists lessened, if somehow the Genesis account could be read in terms which would make possible an accord with geological hypotheses and still maintain in some fashion an ostensibly biblical theology. In recent years, such studies have been especially numerous. Some of these attempts seek to be exegetical, pitting various expressions and phrases against the primary and open sense of Genesis 1. Others simply cast exegesis out entirely, as do the writers of the American Scientific Affiliation in Evolution and Christian Thought Today, by declaring the Genesis account to be quote-unquote poetic. There is a singular absence of quote-unquote poetry in Genesis 1, which is rather declarative. Moreover, if quote-unquote poetry militates against accuracy or historicity, then Luke's account of the virgin birth must be reduced to myth. The basic issue with reference to Genesis 1 was well stated by Kyle and Delitzsch, quote, "Creation is an act of the personal God, not a process of nature," end quote. All harmonistic efforts have in common the desire to reduce creation to process and thereby make it amenable to the apostate science of autonomous man. In a mature creation, the priority of act over process means the priority of an external and sovereign decree of God to the inner workings and development of nature. The entire natural order is irrevocably placed in subordination to decree rather than to process, and this is a death sentence to current scientific theory. Only if the natural order, either through the entelechy of its being or through chance and natural selection, has by process and becoming entered into its being, can the autonomy and integrity of man and his order be preserved against the eternal decree. A mature creation is the product of a sovereign God and an absolute decree, and unavoidably makes the ultimate frame of reference transcendental rather than immanent. Immanence requires process, and process leads to an ever-increasing emphasis on immanence. Scripture never speaks of biological development, but only of degeneration, a waxing old of creation. Biblical maturation is in terms of epistemological self-consciousness, cultural, historical, psychological, and philosophical. In terms of any consistent religion, a faith in process can recognize the existence of a God or a supreme being without feeling any necessity to worship him. To begin with a relatively modern illustration, the knowledge by American Indians of a supreme being has been no small matter of debate. The deists, with their theories of natural religion, were certain that the American Indians worshipped the quote-unquote Great Spirit, and quickly reported such a faith. The anthropologists of the 19th and 20th centuries, in reporting cultic practices, could only cite religious veneration of or association to natural forces, the wolf cult, the spirits of the dead, and similar cultic powers. Accordingly, many decided that no recognition of a supreme being existed among these tribes. In both approaches, a partial report is the basis of the conflict. The American Indians knew of a supreme being, but, contrary to the deists, they did not worship him. His existence was accorded recognition. He was not a proper object of worship. As Wyman has stated with reference to the Navajo, quote, "Man has his place in the universal continuum, and if he misbehaves with respect to the traditional restrictions on human behavior in relation to the quote-unquote supernatural, there is a breakdown in a harmonious balance of things, resulting usually in illness of the transgressor or future illness of his or her unborn child." End quote. Two essential points stand out clearly. 1. Man is part of, quote, the eternal continuum, end quote, and process, the principle of continuity. And 2. His necessary social and religious life requires a proper relation to all else, especially to the contiguous, i.e., that which is immediately next to, above, and below him, the principle of contiguity. Accordingly, worship was given to the immediate natural forces as the relevant powers, in that the awareness religiously of creation as process rather than act made, for example, the sun and rain relevant to agricultural tribes and the wolf and coyote to hunting tribes. The Supreme Being as remote was recognized but not worshipped. Continuity was essential. Thus, as Titieff has pointed out, the cult of the dead was important to Hopi religion, the dead being, while more powerful, still in continuity with their living society. Quote, "In every ceremony, therefore, the cult of the dead plays an important part." End quote. The dead are thus far more important religiously than is a supreme being. The quote-unquote gods, thus, of man's religion, are inevitably anthropomorphic, in that they are created in man's image, as seen in terms of process, and as an aspect of nature. Whenever these religions have been quote-unquote spiritualized and made less continuous with man, they have rapidly eroded, as did Greek religion, into a philosophy which sophisticates the gods only to make, by virtue of the process, man's autonomy of the eternal decree all the more radical and naive. Continuity and contiguity are essential, or the false gods go, to be replaced by others. These gods, natural forces, totems, and spirits constitute a form of Baalim, very closely related to that which, in developed form, was denounced by God as a culminating abomination in Canaan. Canaanite religion was the religious development of the idea of process to its logical and emotional limits. The Baalim were lords, possessors, masters, the spiritual as well as actual immediate powers over man in this great hierarchy of being, whose orderly process required the religious and sociological observance of hierarchical order in the great chain. Quote, "There was no such thing as a god Baal," end quote, for the reference, was to the immediate proprietor or lord in matters spiritual, and a variety of such lords affected the life of every man. Since nature was conceived of as a process, to the extent that hard and fast lines between man and animal were not recognized, the essence of man's life was to advance himself within the framework of process. Man's indebtedness was in a double direction, upwards and downwards, and hence religions of process maintain fraternal relations in both directions, to both lords and quote-unquote servants, as well as to both good and evil powers, so that the demonic power could also be worshipped. The tree served man, but man venerated the tree and kept peace in all directions as the means of advancing the process of being. Moreover, since process moves from the lesser to the greater, from the void to the form, from chaos to order, it follows that the source of power is in the lesser, the void, and in chaos, so that the various forms of Saturnalia enthrone the thief, the beggar, the violent criminal, and total chaos as instruments of social regeneration. As Kai Loa has pointed out, the very societies which emphasize unified continuity see periodic ritual chaos as the means to the golden age, and, quote, "the primordial chaos," end quote, is reenacted as a regenerating force in Saturnalias. Quote, "In fact, the festival is presented as a reenactment of the first days of the universe, the Urzeit, the eminently creative era. The festival is thus celebrated in the context of the myth and assumes the function of regenerating the world." End quote. Among the Jews, the indirect but real influence of this faith became apparent in the Talmudic requirement of Purim, when one must drink until distinction between the two cries, "May Haman be accursed," and "May Mordecai be blessed," becomes impossible. The return to chaos is the obliteration of good and evil in the name of process and the inherent power of process, which is beyond good and evil. Order constitutes a development in need of revitalization through orgy and regeneration, through the ritual baptism in chaos. Hence, the sexual coition with animals, so strongly condemned by Scripture and under sentence of death to man and animal, Exodus 22:18, Leviticus 18:23, 20:15-16, was a ritual act in such religions. Its sub rosa revival in the modern world is significant, as is its inclusion as one of, quote, the 6 types of sexual activity, end quote, by Kinsey. Quote, masturbation, spontaneous nocturnal emissions, petting, heterosexual intercourse, homosexual contacts, and animal contact, end quote. All are deemed equally natural and hence equally normal. Integration downward into the all-powerful void becomes a logical concomitant of the religion of process. The blunt supernaturalism of Scripture, with its ascription of power to God and direction to the eternal decree, is a standing offense to those who want to see an immanent power and decree in nature. How process assimilates ostensibly biblical religion is tellingly seen in Theodore H. Gaster, who can speak of Canaanite religion as the religion of Israel. Quote, refined in the crucible of their own genius, it is this religion that they have passed down to us in the legacy of the Old Testament. End quote. His concluding paragraph is especially revealing. Quote, above all, however, Canaanite religion possesses its own permanent values, and to dismiss it as a mere heathen abomination is to allow the bias and censure of its enemies to take the place of objective judgment. One light differeth from another in glory, and if the faith of Israel is the sun in the firmament of ancient religious thought, that of Canaan is none the less a shining star. Canaanite religion takes us back into a world of thought and feeling informed by concepts and insights, which are none the less precious for having been overborne and overswept in the onrushing tide of history. Here is an approach to the world and its fashion which establishes an intimacy between man and nature such as a mechanical age is apt to obliterate, which validates human existence by making man a necessary agent in the continuous process of creation, which substitutes for the humiliation of dependence the proud status of a co-worker with God. If its forms of expression are crude and its philosophy too immature to satisfy the requirements of a more refined metaphysic, that is only because it issues from the bright intuitions of the world's youth, rather than from the clouded experience of its tired old age. Canaanite religion is assuredly one of the many mansions in the Father's house. End quote. In this statement concerning the quote-unquote precious religion of Canaan, several things are asserted very clearly. 1. The intimacy and continuity between man and nature is affirmed. 2. Human experience is validated when man is made, quote, a necessary agent in the continuous process of creation, end quote. 3. This results in the substitution of, quote, the proud status of a co-worker with God for the humiliation of dependence, end quote. Thus, a hierarchical religion which affirms process and venerates immediate powers, spirits, or saints as ostensibly a humbler faith is, when clearly seen, an exaltation of man to the status of co-worker with God in shaping creation. The hierarchy of being, whether in Canaan, Rome, evolutionary theories, or harmonistic movement within the camp of orthodoxy, is an instrument whereby the eternal decree is undermined by the priority of process, and man is exalted as one of the agents of process. Maturation is conceived as the product of process, and God's eternal decree as the source of a mature creation which is fallen and in rebellion, rather than in the process of maturation, is denied. The biblical faith is in creation as a divine act, not process. Process means positing either an entelechy in nature, a continuum of inherent movement, or the positing of an inherent power which comes to maturation through chance and natural selection. This is the religion of Canaan, which did not deny Jehovah, but rather ignored him. This continuity of process is affirmed by the scoffer within the church of whom Peter spoke, 2 Peter 3, 1-7. The whole point of Scripture is the declaration of the divine acts as alone creative and redemptive, as against man's historical processes and his conceptions of religious and natural process. In Genesis alone, the acts include creation, the curse and penalty of the fall on all creation, interposition in the affairs of Cain and Abel, Enoch, Noah, and the flood, the call and blessing of Abraham, the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, and much more. To reduce creation to process means to naturalize all the rest of Scripture step by step, if logic prevail, and it is significant to note the hostility of all believers in process to any attempt such as that by Whitcomb and Morris in the Genesis Flood, 1961, to give serious consideration to the biblical narrative. The ordination of believers in process is inconsistent with and contrary to the survival of orthodoxy, for process is inevitably a substitute decree for the eternal counsel of the triune God. It is in radical disagreement with the plain statement of Scripture, which is echoed in the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 4, and the Larger Catechism, Question 15. To affirm the act of creation is to affirm the sovereignty of God and the reality and priority of the eternal decree. No small stake is at issue in this controversy. In every affirmation of process, the sovereign and transcendent God is slowly and steadily enveloped by the mists of immanence in man's beclouded mind, and he begins to disappear into a continuous ocean of being in process. Against this, we must affirm that, quote, the work of creation is that wherein God did in the beginning, by the word of his power, make of nothing the world and all things therein for himself, within the space of 6 days, and all very good, end quote. The Larger Catechism, Answer 15.